This ratio could change the way you run forever. If you're tired of running in pain, tired of being injured all the time, today we're going to show you how to implement the ratio to make sure that you don't get injured again. Shona, you sent me such a cool article last week. Tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, Lindsay, it was about New York marathon runners. They had about 50,000 of them, and they studied their training load data over a 16-week period, and were measuring injury prevalence, illness prevalence, using what we call the Acute Chronic Workload Ratio. Really specific sort of...
Whoa. Shona, Acute Chronic Workload Ratio. I can't even say it properly, Shona. Please explain.
No, that's exactly it. It is a big sort of concept, and so let me give you a brief history. A scientist named Tim Gabbett came up with this concept around measuring your acute workload and versus your chronic workload. Again, fancy sort of topics here, but your acute workload is essentially your workload over a 7-day period, and the chronic over a 28-day period. He was trying to just get the points across to sort of say, okay, we're not just going to be measuring our training load week on week, so what I did last week, but actually it's going to be taking the previous 4 weeks into account. And so this article touches on that, but also really try to challenge for runners specifically, the 10% rule, around raising your training load by 10% each week. In the work that you and I have done together with some of your elites, we've used similar concepts to manage your elites. But yeah, I mean, what were some of the takeaways that you got from this with regards to recreational runners specifically?
Yeah, absolutely, and we know that the 10% rule actually hasn't been shown to prevent injury necessarily, but we do have to have a baseline to work off. So essentially what I understood from this article was that the people who got injured were people that were making big changes. It didn't really matter so much where in the 4 quarters that they did. Oddly enough, Q3 was the most prevalent for injury, but that's because I think the marathon comes into view. So the people who haven't been training consistently in Q1 and Q2, they generally made the big jump in Q3, and so that's where we had this prevalence of 40% of the people training were getting either sick or injured. And again, I think the takeaway here is much more around if you are training consistently through the earlier periods, that will prepare your body better so that you can withstand the Q3 and Q4 training, which is as we're peaking to get to the marathon.
I love that you say that, because this is what I tell you about your strength training all the time. You're a champion for 2 weeks, and then you're off for 3 weeks, and then you jump back in. And this is exactly the point, whether it's strength training or your running training, is to rather have consistently building up over time as opposed to these amazing blocks and nothing and amazing blocks and nothing. Liz, you mentioned the 10% rule quite briefly, and I mean, I know I've always just been a bit hesitant to use that with my athletes all the time as a blanket approach. So in this study, does it sort of blow it out of the water?
Yeah, not really, Shona. The study doesn't really differentiate between gender, age, and a whole bunch of other things around training. I think what the study really does do is it highlights big changes. And so while the 10% rule may not be perfect in terms of a blanket approach, what the 10% rule is, it does ask you to implement the changes slowly. I think the take-home message here, again, as we mentioned around my strength training, is that you just really want to be consistent. And to use another example of myself, at university I really wasn't the best student. I didn't do my work consistently over time, and suddenly the exams would arrive, and sometimes I'd be opening my textbook the morning before an exam.
So to not be cramming it all in one go, but over your 6-week training period, to be putting in good bouts over time.
Precisely.
Okay, this is all good and well. Cool, let's jump onto the whiteboard and show everyone in pictures what this actually is. Once you've worked out your acute chronic workload ratio, and Lindsay's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit, but once you've worked it out, you're going to get a number for that day. And so it's either going to be between 0.8 or anything above 1.5. So what that is essentially showing you is where you're almost sitting in your optimal or an injury risk sort of zone. I just want to put a caveat here that of course there's nuances about this, that this isn't an absolute line of yes, you're going to get injured or no, you're not. What Prof. Tim Gabbett was essentially saying is if you have a ratio of 0.8, you're probably sitting in an under-training sort of state. So you're not training enough so that by the time you implement your next training load, you're probably going to get injured because you're not doing enough to then start that training session. So your risk of injury it's lowish, but it is going to start increasing. Over here, we're sitting in what he calls the sweet spot zone. Not a fan of that terminology necessarily, but it's essentially your optimal workload where we're less risk of injury. As we go through that, and as this ratio gets a little bit higher and higher, it takes us up through overreaching and eventually towards that injury risk. So as that ratio gets above 1.5, that's again just saying, okay, red flag, we might be getting a little bit injured. So if you're looking at your training load, again, so if you have your ratio very low, so you're not doing much training, it's a similar sort of graph. So you're coming through this sort of aspect and your workload is going down, similar sort of concept on that side as well. So ideally, we want to sit somewhere between a ratio of around 1 to about 1.2. If we're going above 1.2 to about 1.5, we're sort of pushing the line a bit, and 1.5 and above, that's saying it's a bit of a red flag. Just have a look at how you're feeling, have a look at your training.
Sean, I think just also to jump in here and really just say that this is not about performance. So really what we're talking about here is how to manipulate your training cycles to reduce your risk of injury. And I think that's also always critical to say, is that this doesn't guarantee that you won't get injured, but by making sure that we don't make really big jumps in the short term, that you are greatly reducing your risk of injury.
You're spot on about that, and it's not about performance. So you're using the word optimal workload here. It's about injury risk and concerns. And you know, this is a formula. To get these two numbers is a formula, and of course there's always error in that. But I think it's always nice to have a metric that you can look at as opposed to nothing at all, or just the 10% rule, or yeah, exactly, just to have something to give you an idea of where you're at in your training schedule and load.
Absolutely, Shona. For me, the takeaway from this was actually that you need to take an individualized approach to, in particular, marathon training preparation, and that you need to be sensitive to changes that happen during your plan in response to perhaps illness or going away on a work trip, and that when you then come back to it, not to have these very fixed targets of training time or mileage that you need to achieve, and rather be more flexible on an individual level to make those changes. So it's probably a good idea now to give you a practical example of how to use this and to put some numbers in there so you can actually see what these ratios mean. So here's a practical example for you. What I've done is I've got 4 weeks of total training volumes, which I've marked out in kilometers.
Just a note here that can be miles. When they started this, they'd done it with training load, which was an arbitrary unit. So it can be done with any unit. So we're using kilometers, but if you work in miles, you can do exactly the same thing, the same process, but just in miles.
You could essentially use time too. It'll work in much the same way. But effectively what we've got is we've got an athlete that ran 50 Ks in week 1, 40 in week 2, 50 in week 3, and 60 in week 4. And then we take the total of the 4 weeks. So that is the chronic load. So the chronic load is the total 200 divided by the number of weeks, and that gives us 50 kilometers, right? The acute load is what we've done most recently. So that is our current week of training. So when you're planning what to do in this week, that'll be your acute load versus the whole lot. So week 4, acute divided by the 4-week average, and that'll be 60 divided by 50, which is equal to 1.2. And so in this scenario, we are pretty safe. What happens if in week 4, because we're feeling the pressure of the marathon coming, we up that to 80? So if we up the acute load to 80 on the back of the same 3 weeks, what we end up with is 80 divided by 50, which is equal to 1.45. Now the ratio 1.5 is where we get into the risky area. So you are starting to push yourself right up against the line where you are putting yourself at increased risk of breaking down with an injury, and therefore it also means that if you push that up to 90, you're going to push yourself all the way into that risk. The other thing that Shona spoke about was that if we are getting numbers of 0.8, so in other words, this acute load is actually less than the total average. So if we had to get to a point where you were doing 40 kilometers again in week 4, what that means is that the next jump that you make, it's going to be more important to adjust and bring it down or lower than you perhaps had planned, so that we can get the ratio back over 1, because over 1 tells us that we are progressively overloading and improving our fitness at a reduced risk for injury. Over 1.5 means that we've taken too much of a jump.
Linz, what I love about this is that it's not just taking, so you haven't come out of week 3 and then decided, oh cool, for week 4 I'm doing this. You're actually taking the other 3 weeks into account, as opposed to just what I did yesterday or last week. It's taking that rolling average constantly, and I think that's where the value really lies in a formula like this.
Absolutely, and I think in the study, that's why Q3 was always the one with the highest injury, because the people that didn't do what they needed to do in Q1 and Q2 didn't adjust for that. They jumped to what they thought they needed to do to be able to do a marathon. It's important to note that this ratio cannot guarantee that you will not get injured. It does go a long way to ensuring that you can run pain-free and injury-free. If you would like to further reduce your risk of injury, you can watch the video on screen now.